All right, I would agree that you wouldn't be able to write a holy book that only gives information that's relevant to one time period. But I think that you could write a holy book that had relevant information to every time period.
Right.
And you could have parts that people wouldn't understand at one time period, but they would come to understand in the future. And that would be fine. But I think that I would include those things because it seems like when we read the Bible today, it has no relevant information as far as I can tell. It doesn't tell us anything relevant about the world. Whereas if I was the creator of the universe, I would include things that would continue to be discovered throughout time. Artificial intelligence would be in there. Going to Mars would be in there. Those kinds of things we would expect to see confirmed. But I did want to ask about the genealogy thing because there's
About
the white
what?
genealogy, the Y chromosome markers you mentioned.
Sure.
There are Y chromosome markers in every culture. Every culture of people has Y chromosome markers. Famously, I think Attila the Hun has Y chromosome markers of his lineage that cover like a quarter of the planet and like 70% of Asia, which is quite phenomenal. Interesting, at least. But I don't think that indicates, for example, that you are in a lineage specifically of like Moses or something. I think the consensus of historians is that Moses was a mythical figure, I believe. And so I don't think
Consensus where?
of academic historians and archaeologists who research the time period and the events of going on in that time period.
I mean, we're talking about my uncle. I mean, when people say that Aaron didn't exist and mythological, they're saying that my family it didn't exist. If we ask the vast majority of scholars of the Hebrew Bible, the overwhelming majority would say that Moses was a very important historical figure. The only thing is that it is true that in the secular academic world, it is true that you have a minimalist attitude that they would come up with stuff like that. And I hope your viewers will recognize that it is at least striking that every claim of our people, of our history, is denied by significant swaths of the world who have some interest. And I'm not blaming people. I'm just saying that going back to Moses, to Abraham, there are folks who said that the Temple Mount in the Western Wall, there was no Temple of Solomon that stood there. There are people in the world who have said that the history of our people that occurred during World War II never happened. So we're used to people questioning and doubting, but it's not a good thing. I would just say this to the viewer, that they should reconsider their approach of scholars, because it becomes a kind of, I'm not trying to be obnoxious, but it becomes a kind of North Korea thing. Because in the secular academic world, if you say, I believe that Moses existed and he was a lawgiver and heard the voice of God, if you even say, I'll actually lower the bar, if you actually say that the book of Daniel was written by Daniel, they'll throw you out. They'll look at you like you're crazy. And they don't have the training that Jewish scholars have. And they'll go, no, Daniel couldn't possibly have written Daniel because, after all, I mean, this is another conspiracy, that Daniel spoke about Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of the Seleucid Empire, the fourth. So, I mean, I hope that people I don't know if I can convince you, but at least people should notice that there is a phenomena going on in the minimalist world to essentially cast doubt on almost every aspect of Jewish history until the recent. And I think that should give people pause. You can't prove that something didn't exist. You can prove something did exist. And if archaeology, you mentioned archaeology, so I'm just bringing it, if archaeology was a hard science, and it isn't, then you would have a much greater consensus among archaeologists. But in fact, we find that archaeologists have a certain worldview. And if they have a certain worldview, you and I could predict what they're going to say about discoveries, because archaeology is like having a 1,000-piece puzzle, having only 2 pieces and no picture to work with. So that's why we can predict what archaeologists will say based on their worldview. I think people should at least take pause in saying that we don't know. And as far as DNA goes, what we find among the Jewish people is consistent with the fantastic claims made in the Torah. We're an eternal nation that cannot be destroyed. I mean, here we are, not even a century after 1/3 of my people were murdered in Europe during World War II. Like, what nation endured that? And there are people today who say that that never happened. Well, we exaggerated that. So it is true there are certain circles that are minimalist circles. Maybe if Christians hadn't gone to war for 30 years during the 17th century, maybe the attitude towards religion might be different. I don't know. But our people are real, our history is real, and our destiny is something really very special and remarkable. We want the world to know about that.
Oh, I definitely agree. There are people out there who believe the craziest things. There are people who believe the world is flat. It's always an interesting position to take. But I think the reason professional academics, I don't think have the same bias that you're talking about. I remember Sam Harris was referencing the archaeologists in Israel who are Jewish doing research to try and find confirmation archaeological evidence of the Exodus, and they couldn't find anything. They just found nothing. And if the number of people who were said to have moved from Egypt during that time period had transitioned, we would see archaeological evidence of new homesteads being built in that location at a very massive rate. But that's not what we see. We see them coming along from a long, protracted, slow period of time. And we don't see any pots or evidence of 40 years in the desert of this 500,000 at least people, 1/2 to 2 million people in the desert for 40 years. No archaeological evidence of that whatsoever. And if that population was so massive, it would have been about 1/3 of the entire population of Egypt at that time, if it was true. And there just wasn't enough food to even support that. There's so many facts that seem to contradict the scientific evidence we have about the time period that I think most scholars, including Jewish and Christian scholars, agree when looking at the archaeological and textual evidence that Moses probably didn't exist and was probably a story built upon to convey more figurative meaning to the people. And I think it's not just like they just don't believe because of bias. They're like flat earthers or Holocaust deniers who are just completely ideologically biased. But it seems like there's a lot of very good evidence that seemed to convince me that these stories were more about conveying meaning to the people and giving ideas, kind of like American Indian stories about how their gods interacted with the people at the time period. But I don't think those actually happened, or with how Thor interacted with people.
So this date that we happen to be having this conversation, Tom, marks the 15th anniversary of when Israel bombed and destroyed the Syrian nuclear reactor in an amazing raid. Going back to 2002, the Jewish state discovered that Syria was building a nuclear reactor with the help of North Korea. And for 5 years, the Jewish state gathered more and more evidence that it was because Syria tried to mask what they were doing, tried to use a plane building. They knew what Israel had done to the Osirak reactor years earlier. But Israel had gathered all the intelligence that they needed. That information was shared with the administration of your country. And then in the summer of 2007, Israel, it was less than 30 planes, dropped 22 tons of explosives on the building and destroyed it within a matter of minutes using a corridor going through Turkey, and then came back. And one of the things that's very striking is that Syria didn't say a word about it and still won't. Why? Because it was a defeat for them. They were embarrassed by it. I concede this point to you, that an empire such as Egypt would not have written about their defeat. In the past, nations did write about their history. Sometimes were really lucky because they, instead of putting it on papyrus or vellum, they actually chisel it into a stone or a piece of metal so it remains to this day. But they bragged about their successes and their conquests, not about their defeats. So, again, what we're asking the question is, what we encounter today, the information, what has been written, recorded, is that consistent with the Torah or not? When we look at the DNA of somebody like me, and I could predict that you can study the DNA of someone I've never met in my life who lives in Melbourne, Australia, I could predict that we have a Y chromosome that matches so closely that it can date when our common relative lived roughly 3,300 years ago. The Torah is not a medical book. It's not a science book. It's a book where God tells us about how we should live, what he wants from us, information that we would otherwise not have access to. And God tells us this is what would happen to you during your history. Take a look. No, I'm not going to talk to you about the resurrection of the dead. And it's true. I would not expect Syria in the recent past discussing its defeat, or ancient Egypt in the very far past talking about its defeat. So that's what we're looking for. But we are, I can see this point to you, that the nation of Israel, my people, my nation, we are walking witnesses. You are my witnesses. Witnesses to what? To the national experience and consciousness of our people, an unprecedented event in history where God revealed himself. Not said, look for a celestial sign in the sky. No, it's hearing the voice of God. It's not looking at the moon and looking at its color. No. It's passing on dry land through the sea. So that's our long history that we want to share with the world.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I think that the history of the Jewish people is very profound and interesting, and as a culture is something that should absolutely be respected. But my only issue is when they claim to have this experience where God spoke to them. The first thing I want to ask, which I do for any question, is how do you differentiate reality from imagination? Because humans are very imaginative. We make up all kinds of things. There are tens of thousands of gods all over the world, and many people claim to have seen and spoken to the gods. And so I want to know, is this something I should believe, something I should trust in?
When the Torah says that, one day I'm going to find you, I'm going to bring you home, you're going to be spread from one end of the world to the other. Nations will be impressed with your Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 4. All the nations will go, what a wise nation this is that has such a Torah. But you'll be spread from one end of the world to the other, and your wisdom will spread throughout the world. But you'll remain few in number, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 27. These are outrageous claims. But one day, after a very long exile, Hosea chapter 3, verse 4 and 5, I'm going to bring you home. Isaiah 43, I will find you. I will bring your sons from of the north and your daughters from the south. I will say to the furthest most islands, hold not back. I am bringing you home. And you're coming home to Jerusalem, and there you will be resurrected as a nation in the Holy Land. I will keep my promise, and I love you. Watch me. That's what the God of Israel is saying. He's saying, just watch me. Just watch what I'm doing in history. So instead of looking for a boneyard somewhere in a desert, we're a living testimony. And here we are. After thousands of years, we're tired, but we're rejuvenated by what? By a promise that God made to our people. And we're a living witness to the God of Israel, and we encourage the world to take notice of that. The Torah is very specific about what it predicts, that everyone would know, not DNA and the distance of the moon to the earth, which no one would have had access to. What a worthless piece of information that would have been to my great-great-grandparents who knew nothing about that, had no way to measure that. What a more valuable way to convey and say, I'm with you. I'm with you at every step of the way. If you turn away from me, you're going to have at every stage highly predictable, highly falsifiable events that will occur, and even the worst events. Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7. The worst event in history will happen to you. Umimeno yivoshea, but from it will come your deliverance to the land of Israel. These are really, really amazing things. And the children of Israel, I would submit, are remarkable people. Not I'm saying that as bragging, heaven forbid. I frequently don't feel that I don't say it's too strongly I don't deserve, but I feel humbled by the history of my nation. And yes, there'll be people who will claim that our history never occurred, but we're going to keep reaching out to share that light, not by believe in me and be saved, but look at us, keep your eye on the ball, watch the promise.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה